Hello, friends, and welcome to the first episode of season two of the PaleoPost podcast. This season, as some of you may already know, is going to be a little different than last season, especially where it concerns our new co host, Dr. George Nash. Some of you may have already met him if you listened to our bonus episodes reviewing 2023. Now, we're going to have a lot of fun this season, and we're hoping to bring that fun and enthusiasm through the airwaves to you. If you want to learn about the paleo world from where our ancestors originated, stay up to date on news, books, and so much more, and just have a jolly old time, stay tuned because your weekly post is incoming. All right, guys, here we are. It's officially season two of the Paleo Post podcast. I am so excited. And for those of you who may not have listened to our bonus episodes, I do have some sad news to share, and that our co-host Genevieve von Petzinger will no longer be able to join us, maybe as a guest here and there, but she is, for the time being, taking hiatus from being our co-host, as she has got some crazy fun things going on out in the wild world that she is taking care of. And in that time being, we have got someone absolutely stunning to take her place, and that is Dr. George Nash, who, again, if you listen to our bonus episodes, we introduced him, but I'm going to hand over to him to kind of tell us a little bit about himself, introduce himself briefly, and then we're going to start talking about this week's stuff and what's going on. So, hey, George, how are you?
Okay, Seth, and I suppose on behalf of myself and you, I wish all our listeners a very happy 2024. I
Of course.
somehow, I somehow think there's going to be exciting things ahead of us.
And guys, if anyone knows anything about that, it would be George. So if he says something exciting is coming, I think we need to listen because from what I've learned in the brief time that we've been talking, George kind of knows what's going on. So this might be an interesting podcast that you guys want to listen to. But so George, who are you?
Well, I'm a researcher. I'm connected to two universities. I'm connected to the University of Liverpool, and this is in England, as an honorary research fellow. And then I'm an associate professor at the University of Coimbra in Portugal. It's a long story, but I sort of originated from the University College St David's in Lampeter, way back in the 1980s, and then I had my first major teaching post at the University of Bristol, where I was teaching for 19 years. And I am an archaeologist, but I also wear the hat of being a paleoanthropologist as well, based on the work that I've been doing over the last 5 to 10 years. So very, very busy, lots of enjoyment in caves, fun things in caves, but also dealing with things like, for example, the question that you are obviously asking, Seth, about where we come from.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of people, when Genevieve and I were looking for a new co-host, we wanted to find someone who not only was knowledgeable about our human origins, our shared story, but might bring an interesting flair to the show. And of course, your interesting flair is the fact that you have been to so many of these cultural heritage sites around the world, dealing with rock art and cave art and research and just art in general. And that flair that you're going to bring, of course, knowing that you came from a recommendation from Genevieve, it makes sense that's art related. But I think
Mm.
the flair that you're going to bring to the show this season, a lot of people are going to be very excited to hear your personal anecdotes and experiences. And today, guys, we always talked last season about how there was always so much news going on in the field and how we always had stories to cover. And maybe it's just because everyone's coming back from the field right now and they're writing their papers are being published, or of course it's the holidays around the world. But there really just was not that much news in the world of paleoanthropology in the last week since we did our yearly recap. So, in this episode, we're really going to focus more on talking a bit more about George and his history, some of his stories that he'd like to share about some of the amazing and fascinating sites that he's been to. Before we get into that, though, there is one story that I would like to bring up that came out I believe yesterday it was published in Nature. This paper detailing the dentition of Homo habilis and how it much more resembles that of the Australopithecine. Now, for anyone who has been following human origins since really this study began and Homo habilis was discovered, there's been a big controversy on whether habilis should be in the Homo genus or whether it's an Australopithecine based on its brain size and other morphological features. So now we have another in the Australopithecine category, and I don't know. I think habilis might be losing its genus title at some point. What are your thoughts on that, George? Do you have any feelings on the handyman?
Well, it's funny, really, because I actually read probably the same article as you did.
Mm-hmm.
And what is interesting, there's that big problem in trying to determine the differences and the similarities between Australopithecines and Homo habilis, and there isn't much between the two of them, to be quite honest. So, yeah, there is a quite a big debate, I think, arising really from maybe last year, and it'll go on, I think, for quite some time. Of course, what you have to take into consideration, and I think this is an important problem for all of us, really, in that when we are looking at the fossil record of our ancestors, we are looking at a very, very minute uh, fragmentary sample of each of our cousins, and that's the big problem. And, for example, my skeletal frame might be quite different to, say, yours, Seth, in that
Right.
I'm bigger, I'm larger, and so you're playing a guessing game in some respects. You really do need to see a lot of skeletal material to try and assess this idea of what our cousins are and who they are and where we put them. And that's our big problem. So, for example, if we look at our friend Lucy, for example, we were very fortunate when that was discovered in Ethiopia, if I remember rightly. The fossil record there was good, but we need another 4 or 5 Lucies to confirm what we're actually looking at to make that assessment. And also, not just that, to assess locomotion, to assess dietary, look at teeth, for example, dentition. So there is, that big problem. Going back to our old friend, your friend of mine, Mr. Naledi, we're fortunate there that we have, I think, around about 2,000 fragments of fossil remain just from one site in Rising Star. So we can start to make some inferences. In the distant future, I still think there's a lot of work to be done on those skeletons, or those human remains or those hominin remains from the Denali chamber in Rising Star. But I think we'll have a more clearer picture of what's going on there than we have with a lot of our other cousins that we've been trying to work out about where they come from. And what I'm trying to say is that one skeleton does not make a cousin. We need lots of skeletons or lots of skeleton material, fossil material, to work out a distant a distant cousin in the past.
Absolutely. I think that brings up a really good point. And even deviating from talking about habilis for a second, you mentioned Naledi, and for those of you, I mean, practically anyone who follows me and my channel knows a lot about Naledi, my favorite hominin, and what really got me into this in 2013 and everything. Everything that we know about Homo naledi comes from one locale. That's it. Everything. Not even, there is not a single anything attributed to Homo naledi found outside of Bryson. And so when you talk about needing more, I think that definitely, it's not just more skeletons that we need, it's more everything that we need to understand what this species is. And there are still people, it's much less today than it was 10 years ago, who argue that Homo naledi is not its own species because it morphology is slightly different than Homo erectus, for some people argue. Not that some people that I do not agree with on almost anything. I think people know who that is. But when we're talking about putting species in genuses and trying to understand when a skeleton belongs to a species, there's so much that goes into considering it. And as soon as a fossil is found that is supposed to belong to that species that has a different attribute, it kind of throws a wrench in a lot of people's ideas on what is supposed to make that species. So I think the fact that we now have this dentition that's really pointing to, hey, maybe they are closer to Australopithecine. And if we draw a Venn diagram of, Australopithecine, Homo, and then what they share in the middle, they share a lot in that middle section, uh, a lot of things. But even if we just keep adding more to the Australopithecine side for Homo habilis, I feel like, and again, for those of you who don't know, Louis Leakey fought so hard to get Homo habilis to be determined as a Homo. He fought so hard. He wrote so many papers. He went on so many campaigns. He tried so hard because he truly believed that's where it belongs. And now that's where it stands, regardless of whether that's true or not. And a lot of people disagree with him. So I think we'll have to see if Homo habilis stays as the first in our genus or if that falls to someone else. But I think it's good that the work is still being done and it's being looked at. We haven't just given up and said, well, we figure he's the first or it is the first, so we'll just stop there. The line between Australopithecine and Homo is a very gray one and fuzzy one. We have Australopithecus sediba in there that some people think might be that line, like right in the sand. And then we've got a lot of other contenders in there. Do you think it matters, honestly, where we draw that line?
There's an interesting point to consider, really, and it's in the names as well. Homo habilis. Homo habilis is really one of our first species to be us, basically, and it's leading towards us. And I think maybe there's a thing, like the idea of time and space. Time in terms of how long Australopithecine and Homo habilis were roaming the Earth, which is a considerable amount of time. And I think you can suggest that we can look at the idea of morphing, the morphology of one species into another. That I think that's an acceptable way of going forward. But also, as well as there's this spatial and thing we need to think about as well, about where these things fit within the world that we live in today, and where we are doing our research. And again, one of the big problems has been, I mean, this is a good example, in fact, this is a personal story. Of the 19 years that I taught prehistory at Bristol, I can only think of one dissertation, one undergraduate dissertation, no postgraduate dissertations on early hominins.
Wow.
And so there's our problem for a start. There's not enough people doing the research. There certainly wasn't at Bristol anyway. And this is quite interesting because at Bristol we were right next door to a very good medical school and a very good dentistry school within the university campus. So you would think that there would be that sort of synergy between between anatomy and physiology, the study of early hominins, and also looking at the way or the potential how we could bring those subjects together and generate interest amongst potential students and postgraduate students. So thereby goes a problem, and I suspect that's something which is being repeated in a lot of universities. However, what has changed a lot, certainly at Bristol, is that we developed a few years ago, about 15 years ago, a department of anthropology and archaeology. And eventually we lost archaeology and we just have now a department of anthropology. I say we, I'm not there anymore, but at the time there was just a department of anthropology at the end. And that will surely, hopefully, generate the interest, the stimulus for undergraduate students to move forward and start thinking about paleoanthropology, for example. And again, that's where we've got to move. That's our next move, is to get people interested in this fascinating subject.
Absolutely. And, it definitely is, I think, the next big move that we need to take in order to progress in furthering understanding what's going on. Um, so, okay, we've talked about this story a little bit. There's really not a whole ton to uncover. Why don't we switch gears to our next topic that we're going to talk about? And I think you had a story you wanted to tell. You have brought up already, George, so many sites and caves and locations just since we've talked that I feel like I honestly need to start taking notes on which ones you're talking about. So I do not recall which one you mentioned, but I know it was one that we've talked about that you wanted to talk about a little bit more.
Seth,
yes.
Today, Seth, I'm going to talk to you about King Arthur.
Let's do it. King Arthur. Let's do it.
There's a good start. But what's really interesting about this, I've got a personal story with the site I'm going to be talking about. It's also very topical because there's a paper just being released in a very, very good journal. Now, for the people listening to this podcast, obviously I'm from the UK, and I taught at Bristol, but I was also, and still am, a member of the University of Bristol Speleological Society. It's one of the earliest university speleological societies in the UK, if not the world, in fact. It goes back, I think, a good 60 or 70 years, maybe more than that, in fact, now I come to think of it. And the Speleological Society deals with, obviously, caves within, not just within the British Isles. It also ventures into Ireland, and it also ventures into places like Rising Star, because one day I will probably publish a paper on Rising Star, and it will be published in the University of Bristol Speleological Society proceedings. And what's really interesting about this particular journal, it's run by two very good friends of mine, Linda Wilson and Graham Mullin, and plus obviously the team that works with them. And they don't just publish the proceedings, but they also manage a lot of the caves which are in the locality of Bristol, in the Mendip Hills, which is a limestone outcrop which is just south of Bristol. But also they've been working all over the place in their careers. And back in the 1990s, when I was a postgraduate student, I worked with a guy called Nick Barton, who's the Baden-Powell professor at the University of Oxford. And one of the projects he started was this Wye Valley project. And the Wye Valley is spelled W-Y-E. It's the River Wye. It's a very, very deep and mature river that cuts through the limestone landscapes of South Herefordshire, and then eventually ventures into Wales and into the River Severn, which is the largest river we have in the British Isles. And the River Wye, at this one point in South Herefordshire, obviously cuts through creates a massive oxbow gorge. And either side of that gorge are lots and lots of, guess what, caves. And all those caves have been looked at over the last 150 years at least. And some of them have been named, and they've all got Arthurian names. And Nick Barton, in the early 1990s, he took on this project and named some of the cave sites and rock shelters that he looked at, and also gave them Arthurian names as well. And all of them have yielded really interesting material. And in my case, there's been a lot of what I would call portable art. And when I say portable art, I mean art in a very, very, how can I put it, esoteric way, but with inverted commas. So, for example, at Maddox Rock Shelter, which is not too far from King Arthur's Cave, Nick Barton's team excavated the site and found, I think, around about 7 or 8 pierced cowrie shells. And again, that's another story for another episode, which I would like to talk about. But anyway, he found pierced cowrie shells, which were obviously some form of adornment for a male or female roaming around the landscape around about between 10 and 15,000 years ago. So he's carried on the tradition of naming the caves using the Arthurian characters from the Arthurian legend, which is well and truly embedded into British history, British prehistory, and British archaeology. You always find somewhere a Merlin's cave or an Arthur's cave or a King Arthur's cave,
right?
And we've got it in the Wye Valley. Anyway, with the Wye Valley, one of the first sites to be excavated was excavated by a guy called the Reverend Simmons. And the Reverend Simmons is a very interesting character because he did a lot of sort of armchair archaeological excavations, very, very bad excavations in my view, in the latter part of the 19th century. And in fact, one of the areas of the Wye Valley, which listeners may want to Google at some point, is a place called Simmons Yacht, which is a very strange name. But Simmons is basically named after the Reverend Simmons. And Simmons Yacht is this area where King Arthur's Cave is located. It's on an oxbow bend. It's part of a limestone cliff or upper cliff face, which runs east-west. And within that cliff face are about 4 or 5 caves, but one very big one, which is called King Arthur's Cave. And if you venture sort of west of that cliff face, you come to a big area which has been quarried really very badly. And really, I would argue that it's probably wiped out a lot of really good archaeology, but it's all part of, I suppose, the history of the area, because the area was actually quarried for limestone in the historical period, certainly in the latter part of the 19th century and just before. And in fact, King Arthur's Cave, if I remember rightly, was actually mined for its limestone during the Roman times. So the cave as we see it today is not the cave what we would have seen pre-Roman times. And again,
Okay.
the one thing I always say, Seth, is an important thing is when we are looking at cave sites, especially in limestone areas, we have to, I think, add another 50% of the length of the current cave onto what the cave would have looked like. Easily, I would say, yes, because of the soluble nature of limestone, and over time it just gets eaten away. If it doesn't get eaten away, it gets quarried away, and if it doesn't get quarried away, it collapses. And a good example of that is the cave site I'm working on at the moment, down on the Gower coast, where we have at least, I would say, 40 or 50% of the original cave ceiling as a collapsed deposit, extending from the current cave entrance out towards the Bristol Channel. So it just gives you an idea about the destructive nature of the natural agencies that attack limestone over a long period of time, over geological time, or certainly archaeological time.
I've asked Genevieve this question, and I want your opinion. Out of all the rock art, that humans have created, which we don't, know exactly when that started, of course, how much of it do you think is left, percentage-wise?
I'm going to stick my neck out and say there's an awful lot left to be discovered, because the one thing I've learned over the last 15 years is a good friend of mine called Mr. D Stretch. And Mr. D Stretch can see things that my eyes, your eyes, or anybody else's eyes can't. And what I'm finding is that archaeologists like myself 20 years ago were quite happy to look on the floor, or the floor spaces, the floor areas of caves and rock shelters, but never look at the walls. And it's only now that we're starting to find things. And I would predict that the caves that I've looked at in my career, I need to relook at again, only because I'm finding things. So the story I'm going to tell you now, which is really interesting about King Arthur's Cave, as I said to you before, the University of Bristol Speleological Society transactions have published a lot on King Arthur's Cave. And the most recent paper has just come out. It came out in the latter part of 2023, and I'll talk to you about that in a minute. But myself and my son James, who's 15, we did a reconnoitre in the caves of the Wye Valley around Simmons Yat last year, and also in 2022. And surprise, surprise, taking my eyes away from my archaeological mindset, I decided to look at the cave walls and cave ceilings of King Arthur's Cave, and lo and behold, we found rock art. So that's really exciting. So just again, put you in the picture, the King Arthur's Cave entrance, as we see it today, I think would have extended at least 40 odd meters, maybe further forward than it does today, like all the other caves along that ridge. And what is interesting is that in terms of its archaeological history, and again, I think I said to you a few weeks ago that sometimes the archaeological history is as important as the archaeology itself. And what the Reverend Simmons did, bless his cotton socks, he excavated the cave looking for goodies, and he bottomed the cave in one of the main gallery, and all the spoil, luckily, was dumped just outside the cave, the current cave entrance. So when you go there today, you will see a large deposit in front of the entrance, and you walk up that deposit into the cave proper, and the actual deposit that you're walking on is actually Simmons' excavation debris. It's his spoil heap. And what was really interesting is Nick Barton's team in the early 1990s did an excavation through that spoil heap, and he did what we would call reverse stratigraphy. And the reverse stratigraphy revealed that the upper layers of the current spoil heap is the oldest deposits, and as you go further down, quite rightly so, the most recent deposits, the Mesolithic, the Neolithic, the Bronze Age, the Roman, and the medieval deposits are at the bottom of the spoil heap.
Right.
So he did a section through that spoil heap, and obviously found some very, very early flint. Because what we've got there, what we thought we got there, we got a Middle Paleolithic deposits in the left-hand chamber, which is the smaller of the two chambers as you walk into the entrance. And then you have in the main in the main chamber, Upper Paleolithic, and we have a near complete sequence of lithics, which date from really the Ogden Nation right through to the Mesolithic and Neolithic and Bronze Age. So it just gives you an idea about what's been found there in its past. So in 1870, the Simmons excavation revealed a lot of biggie goodies, as I call them. They were looking for goodie stuff. So things like mammoth teeth, some really good other faunal evidence as well, Arctic vole, Arctic lemming, all sorts of things that you'd expect to find in a periglacial cave site, such as King Arthur's Cave. Now, remember, you were very, very close to the ice margin during the Devensian. So if you walked out of that cave 15, 20, 30,000 years ago, you would meet a wall of ice about a kilometre away. So the actual cave is really at the top of a really very, very nice U-shaped valley, which was obviously cut out by the glaciers. But the glaciers didn't come as far as King Arthur's Cave. So King Arthur's Cave was probably was inhabited, albeit seasonally or maybe even biannually, over maybe 15, 20,000 years. But we do know that before the onset of glaciation during the Devensian, at around about 50,000 years ago, we have evidence of Middle Paleolithic occupation there, which was obviously probably Neanderthal. So that's, again, interesting in itself. And I said to you before, the lithic assemblage is interesting. What it does need, and this is me whispering to you now, Seth, we need a good PhD student to go in there and make a reassessment on all the lithics, because I don't think there's been a good job done on it. And the reason why I say that is that Simmons, I don't know how it happened, but the Simmons excavation divided up all the lithics, all the material from that excavation, and it went to the British Museum, Hereford City Museum, Monmouth City Museum, and also at the little museum we have within the University of Bristol, which is run by Graham and Linda. So that's interesting in itself.
Right.
And it wasn't just the lithics, Seth. It was also the human bone and the animal bone as well. It was all divvied up. And one nice little story, which is for me, which was interesting, is that, as you may have gathered, I'm interested in artistic endeavour, be it either portable or on a wall. And Simmons found a small bone fragment there with a stylized fish on it, engraved fish, which he considered it to be an eel. And this was looked at by a guy called Hewer, who was another very, very eminent archaeologist who did do very good recording in the early 1920s, mid-1920s, around the Wye Valley at that time. And the bone piece went to the British Museum, and guess what? They lost it. So that was the end of that.
Wow.
That was the end of that. So all we have really, sadly, is a piece within the transactions or the proceedings of the University of Bristol Speleological Society papers of Simmons's discovery, which is reported in Hewer, and that's it. That's all we have. We don't have the actual physical piece, which is a bit sad. But there we are. So
it is. I wonder if that's one of those stories where, something along the lines of who was it? Not the Tong Child, but Littlefoot, where 20 years from now, someone will be going through a drawer at the British Museum and find a piece and wonder, hey, what is this? And we'll have this whole discovery of a refound fossil that was lost.
Yeah.
Like you said, the history of archaeology sometimes is as important as the archaeology itself.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Very important.
Yes. And I mean, going back to the lithics, there's a guy called Arthur Ap Simon, who's he was a member of the University of Bristol Speleological Society. He's a wonderful guy. I think he may have just died recently, but he has produced or did some work in Arthur's Cave on the lithics. But again, we were now looking at lithics in a very, very different way to how we were maybe 40 or 50 years ago. So I think it does. I think the lithics do need to be reassessed. But again, the big problem is gathering all that material up into one big pile and going through it lithic by lithic and making that assessment. So that's where we are at the moment. And I said I just mentioned very quickly about the Nick Barton work. Nick did. He surveyed King Arthur's Cave. He surveyed Merlin's Cave, again, the Arthurian connection. And he also did excavations on a number of rock shelter sites within the Wye Valley. And they, again, yielded some very interesting material, dating from the Paleolithic right through to the Roman period and beyond. So that's interesting. And then suddenly coming through my letterbox in late December was the University of Bristol Speleological Society transaction for 2023. And the first paper within that is an assessment on human and animal bone, radiocarbonating the animal bone in particular, not the human bone, but the animal bone from King Arthur's Cave. And that's, again, yielded some very interesting dates, which confirm, really, in many respects, what Barton was saying and what Hewer was saying in the 1920s. And again, for those who are listening, for those of you really interested in what I'm talking about, I hope some of you are, you can download the papers from the University of Bristol Speleological Society for free And what I'll do is I'll send you the link for that for the transactions to you at some point in the next couple of days, Seth.
Yes, and then those will be so we haven't mentioned it, but these episodes will be going out on Fridays, 4 p.m. Pacific time, and George and I will record them sometime during the week. So since today is Saturday already, this episode will come out on the what is it? The 12th.
It'll be the 12th, yes,
Yeah,
the 12th, that's
it'll
right.
be the 12th. And by then, I'll have those links and I'll make sure they're put in the show notes and you guys can follow up with what George is talking about. And any other links that we mentioned during the show, I'll make sure are included in the description, whether you're watching this on YouTube or if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, which either way helps us out. But please make sure you like and share those videos and podcasts. But anyways, continue, George, with what you were saying.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm going to bring you up to date now. As I said to you earlier, very briefly, myself and my son James, we did a reconnoitre of the cave site of King Arthur's Cave, and obviously the two main chambers have been battered because of people lighting fires in there, and also it was as I said to you before, it was mined by the Romans and probably in the medieval period as well. And a lot of that area has been sort of quarried and mined, if it's a cave or if it's open cast, over the last 150 years anyway. But James and myself, we went into some of the narrow passages right at the back of the King Arthur's cave system. And I call it a cave system because obviously I think it's been explored, but not very well explored. And lo and behold, right at the back of one of the passages, I'm just about to publish that paper, in fact, we found a very, very nice sort of presence of a really nice deep red hematite. I suppose the word blob would be the better word for it than any other word. And that's not secreted, that's actually applied hematite. So we've got something there. I can't date it because there's no stala or flowstone over it.
Right.
But it does indicate to me that we got something quite interesting there. To the point that I did a series of photographs of potential candidates for potential rock art, and then put them through D-Stretch. And lo and behold, we again have found more stuff there. But we do need to go back and because it was just a reconnoitre. But we're going to do the work a bit more in a bit more of a systematic way. And again, this will be reported. Actually, I'll probably be reporting it into the University of Bristol Speleological transactions at some point in 2024. So that's where we are at the moment with this particular story. Just going back to the paper that's been published by people from the Speleological Society on King Arthur's Cave. They've just really carbon dated the animal bone, some of the animal bone, from the collection that is held at the Society's little museum at the University of Bristol. So again, just a nice little story to think about when we are putting together understanding the narrative of this very, very complex cave. And again, one thing I haven't mentioned is what we've got there is the so-called mammoth layer, again, which was excavated in the 1920s and the 1950s, which is in the left-hand chamber. And what they found there was a series of hearths and also a lot of mammoth bone. And again, one sad story for this, and it's again a personal story, when I was employed as my first job as a postgrad, I just got my MPhil at the time, a master's. It was to do all the recording of all the prehistoric material at Hereford City Museum. And within the Hereford City Museum collection is the material from both the Simmons excavation, or some of it from the Simmons excavation, and some of it from the Cure investigations. I won't call them excavations, I'll call them investigations in the 1920s. And sadly, the people who were in charge of conserving the material put all the bone material right next door to a pipe, which provides the central heating for the museum. And so when I went to look at the material for the first time, I think in maybe 80 years in the 1990s, it turned to dust.
Yeah.
So that's that story.
Wow.
But again, just an interesting story about what happens if you don't conserve bone material properly.
Yeah, seriously. And I've taken a few forensic anthropology classes, and it's really amazing the effect, or just what happens to bone under various taxonomic, or not taxonomic, excuse me, taxonomic, uh,
Yeah.
exposures and whatnot. And definitely heat is a very interesting stimuli on bone and what it can do to it. So being next to a heating pipe like that, I can imagine the damage that it caused. Yeah, that's pretty unfortunate.
It's pretty severe, really, in many respects. I mean, there is still some a mammoth material there, and also some reindeer material there. I mean, there's quite a good faunal record, but the sad thing about it is a lot of it was lost because of the conditions that they were being stored in, which was, and again, it's just a product of the time. I'm not laying any blame on any conservator, because 100, we're talking nearly 100 years ago, the material would have been stored in boxes and then left in the basement of the museum, and that's where they were, and that's how I found them. The lithic material obviously is in very, very good condition, and it's well recorded. But it's just sad to see the bone turn to dust. But there we are.
Absolutely, and it's definitely not the first time that something like that happened in our line of work, unfortunately, and it definitely will not be the last.
Yeah.
But so going on to, because you're during these, for new listeners to season 2 of the PaleoPost podcast, we usually talk about three stories from the news of the week. As I mentioned, we haven't really had that much news going on. So we talked about one story. George talked about King Arthur's cave. Now, why don't we talk about, well,
I mean, I don't know if listeners want to hear. I've got 2 books which are worth talking about, just very, very briefly. And again, I'll put up we can put up the link for these books if anybody's interested in either looking at them further or purchasing them.
absolutely. We will definitely do the reviews, and we'll put the links up into the reviews. Let's do that. Yeah. Why don't you go over the reviews, and then I will think of a next topic for discuss while you're doing that, because
Okay.
guys, again, usually there's just so much to talk about, but it's just been a calm week, and there's nothing wrong with that. That just means more news will be coming out soon. So George, why don't you lead us off on some book reviews? And again, we will link these books in the description so you can look into them further if you are interested.
Okay. Well, the first book I've actually reviewed for Current Archaeology, which is a British archaeological magazine. Very, very good. I recommend it. And it's a book called The First Stones. And don't be fooled by the title, because you think the first stones, you think you're looking at early stone tool industries in Africa, but it's not. It's to do with the excavation or a reassessment of the excavation of 2 cracking Neolithic sites called Gwernvale and Penywylod, which are both in central Wales. And again, the interesting story about these particular 2 sites is that they were both excavated by very, very good archaeologists, and the one guy is one of my heroes, a guy called Hubert Savary, who did a lot of work. He was from the University of Liverpool. But the book is edited by 2 guys, Bill Brittle, who excavated Penywylod, and a guy called Alistair Whittle. And Alistair Whittle was professor. He's now retired. He was professor at University of Cardiff in Wales. And he's done a lot of work on the European Neolithic. So the two very, very seasoned and good quality archaeologists. And they've brought together a really good book, bringing together the experts to look at the lithics, looking at the environmental work, the radiocarbon dating. There's very extensive radiocarbon dating on both sites. And pertinent to this podcast is that at Guernevale, am I thinking right? Yes, Guernevale, they found not just Neolithic lithics, but also Mesolithic flint and also Upper Paleolithic flint. So again, for those of you, again, this is a story, something I always tell my students. When you're looking at a Neolithic site or a Bronze Age site or even a Paleolithic site, just be aware that there is a history before and after the site that's been labelled as a Neolithic, Mesolithic or Paleolithic site. And what's interesting there is that we have potentially within the lithics assemblage from the Upper Paleolithic, there's not very many lithics there, but that was looked at by a good colleague, a good friend of mine called Elizabeth Walker, who is the curator of the National Museum of Wales. Her speciality is lithics, and she worked with Stephen Oldhouse Green on the cave site of Paviland or Goat's Hole Cave on the Gower Coast, and did a fantastic sequence. So this specialist really knows her stuff when you're looking at Paleolithic flint. And I think what we've got there is a classic site of, first of all, it's a settlement site, maybe what I would call a utilization station, whereby Paleolithic hunter-gatherers are settling there, albeit seasonally, and you're making full value of the carcass utilization of what they catch. And at that time, you would have had mammoth, bison, horse, elk, reindeer roaming that landscape south of a retreating ice margin. Now, remember, at the glacial maximum, the Devonian ice sheets in the British Isles would have been about 40 or 50 kilometres south of this particular site. So we're looking at a retreating glacier, and at one point, maybe 12, 13,000 BP before present, you've got advanced hunter-fisher-gatherers developing this site, and then over time, it becomes ancestral. You get the Mesolithic flint there as well, so they're using the same site, maybe for the same purposes, but it's not until the Neolithic that it becomes ritualized, and they decide to build a large Neolithic chambered monument on that particular site. So the archaeology or the archaeological processes used by Bill Bricknell really do reveal a really interesting sort of stratigraphy, which dates over maybe 8 to 10,000 years. So from the time the site was used as a Neolithic site at around about 3,500 BC, right through back in time to maybe 12,000 BC. So again, a really interesting sequence of archaeological stratigraphy within that one site, and it's reported in this book. And again, what I like about this particular book is it doesn't just focus on the two sites of Penny-Willard and Guernevale, which are very close together, but also puts into a regional context as well, which is what we all want, really, so we can understand what we're talking about. And then the second book, which I haven't reviewed yet, but I have had a brief look at, is all about, it's called Reimagination, a Human and Animal Relationships in the Circumpolar North. So basically, it's looking at everything north of the Arctic Circle. So it's looking at stuff from northern Norway, Russia, Svalbard, Canada, looking at Inuit, and it ranges from the Paleolithic right through to the post-medieval period during the whaling era of history. Very, very interesting book, an eclectic series of papers, but the papers I quite liked were the ones on portable art. And again, I'll just finish off by saying one thing I did notice, which I suppose irritates me a little bit, is that modern, or say contemporary researchers today tend to look at contemporary references rather than looking at the original references. And luckily for me, when I did my PhD or my DPhil in Norway 30 odd years ago, I had to use the references of my contemporaries, but I also used the original references of the area of research I was researching, which was obviously Norwegian rock art. And one thing I found irritating in this particular book, but it's still a good book to buy,
Right.
is that some of the references I noticed being used by the people writing the chapters were still embedded in people who were reporting on the the rock art or the portable art, and not referring to the original references. People like Sognus, for example, and I found that a little bit irritating. But nonetheless, still a good book to get hold of.
Absolutely. And these both sound like excellent reads that'll really help embrace and introduce your knowledge on the local rock art of the area that you're speaking about and everything. And I think for those interested, those links will definitely be very useful. And one thing that I love about doing these book reviews every episode is these aren't books that are in the top 10 on Amazon, that you're going to hear of. These are
Really not.
these are definitely books that you are only getting because you are hearing from a rock art expert, Mr. or Dr. Nash here. And I think that is something you guys really should take advantage of, because I know some of these books I'm going to be checking out because rock art obviously is extremely fascinating to me. So, since this is the first episode of season two, and we're still introducing you a little bit, George, a lot of people may not know, and I'd be curious to know, since we are officially in January, you belong to a team that is currently investigating whether or not Homo naledi, the hominin from South Africa that we were discussing during the beginning of this episode, you are investigating whether or not they left engravings deep, deep down in the earth inside this complex, extraordinarily hard, at least for species of our size, to get to uh, locations in this cave. You've mentioned in previous episodes you might be going back in January. And I'm sure the listeners would be interested in hearing if any of those arrangements have been made, and if you've had a chance to talk to Lee at all about anything that you've uncovered, or if we're still waiting to hear some news.
Well, Seth, we're still waiting for the decisions to be made. As you well know, Lee is now working for, or he's being sponsored by the Natural Geographical Society, or Natural Geographic Society. And obviously, they are very interested in whatever Lee does. Obviously, I can't say too much at the moment because obviously I really need to tell you, I suppose. But we had a meeting the other day, and it looks like that 2024 is going to be a very exciting, very busy year, certainly for the first art team. We will be going back at some point. I think what's really fantastic news is that, which I think I can whisper, is that I think there's moves now to get the cave system, not just the cave itself, but the whole system digitally mapped out, so we get really very, very accurate. Because whatever we find down there, be it art or no, I would say mark. Let's think of another word. If we find markings down there which are Naledi or modern human or whatever, we will be able to accurately pinpoint these sites onto a really good digital file, which will be obviously 3D as well.
Right.
And I think if, and again, I can't say too much, but I think this is going to happen in the next 3 or 4 months. So this is really good news, really, for Lee's work, because obviously the work he's doing is pioneering work, and it's going to be very, very exciting to actually see some of the squeezes that I encountered in a digital format, for example. I can think to myself when I'm looking at this plan of the Rising Star system, thinking, how the hell do I get down there? But yeah, but what I'm really excited about, I mean, for me, and I've been thinking a lot about this, and I've got to speak to Lee next week. We've got a meeting with Lee next week. The one thing I would be wanting to do now, in hindsight, is to, because I think we all know it's actually in the public domain that all three entrances into the Naledi system, into the Naledi caves where the Naledi is buried, have been heavily truncated and disturbed by the mining industry, who are mining for calcite to make the gold more pure. Underneath all that debris that I've encountered, there must be a prehistoric, early prehistoric stratigraphy that needs to be looked at. So the one thing I'm going to be suggesting to Lee, although you may have thought about it himself already, is to think about doing some test pits within these entrances. One particular place is where there is it's quite a large cavern entrance into the Naledi system. Into the Rising Star system, and we know for a fact that the entrance was occupied during the Iron Age. So the one thing I would be wanting to do maybe is to look at that in more detail, but also maybe come away from where that Iron Age area is and move towards either the centre of the entrance or maybe to the opposite side and just do some test pits and just see what we've got there. Because I would suggest, and this is an interesting point, and maybe you could add some view on this, that nearly all of the cave systems I've visited and studied and researched is that the cave system is divided into private and public space.
Right.
And the public space is the entrance where you've got your community, your communal areas, the settlement areas, the cooking areas, the sleeping areas. But as you go further back, you get the private space, the sacred space. And this is very, very important because that's where you're going to find all your burials. And I can't think, that's why all the cave sites I've visited in the British Isles have that idea of public and private space. And I had one student who did a very, very good dissertation on Neolithic cave burials in North Wales. And lo and behold, nearly all the caves that he visited, all the antiquarian and archaeological evidence towards this idea that you have your day-to-day settlement in the entrance, but as you go further back, you then start to get these sacred spaces, and it's within those sacred spaces, surprise, surprise, that you find the rock art, and that's going to be quite interesting. So I think Lee is scratching the tip of a massive research iceberg at the moment, and that's really exciting, not just for my generation and Lee's generation, because we're both of a certain age, but I think with generations to come. And there's some really fantastic people working with him at the moment who will relish the idea of doing more research within that cave system. And just remember that Rising Star is one of 300, not 30, not 3, but 300 potential cave sites within the Cradle of Mankind World Heritage Site. So again, really interesting times are ahead. And the one thing I would be wanting to find now, if I was Lee, and I know he wants to find it as well, is in one of those caves, other caves, that we find more Naledi.
Right. I think that would cement a lot of his hypotheses about what is going on if we were to find another system that actually had identifiable, morphologically similar remains as what was found in Rising Star. I think that is something they're heavily looking for. And as far as I know, most of the work they're doing right now outside of Rising Star is at Gladysdale and at it's one other site that I can't remember the name of. But like you said, there's 300 or more caves. Those are just the documented ones. Who knows what's, by far no one has explored all of them looking for them.
Yeah.
Even in Rising Star, when the remains were discovered by Rick Hunter and Stephen Tucker, they weren't there looking for hominin remains. They were just caving.
Exactly.
So who knows what the next sporting event will discover for the world of, paleoanthropology, because it's not always when you're looking for these things that you find them. It's they kind of just appear when you're least expecting them almost.
Yeah, and I think also the interesting point is that of the 300, the 300 caves, well, the number 300 is quite significant in that a lot of the caves that Lee found was found through Google Earth. So he actually worked out, he devised a pattern by looking at where the trees were growing within the veld, and where the trees were growing was usually where there was a deep root system that was taking advantage of the water that was being collected in those caves. So
Exactly.
there's a really good way of sort of doing GIS work, for example. I mean, there's a PhD for somebody doing, so we want to understand about distribution of our distant cousins through GIS. Get started. There it is. It's all there, waiting for you to do. So there's a lot of things to be done there. A lot of exciting things to be done there. And going back to Gladysville, I went to Gladysville, and you go into that cave system. It's massive, and the reason why it's massive is because it's been mined to hell. because of the the requirements of the gold industry, the building industry, and the agricultural industry that you had in South Africa during the latter part of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century. However, the material that which they discarded is the material that Lee's team wants to get hold of, because that's where all the fossils are. And although they've only found a couple of fossil remains belonging to hominins, there is a really good faunal evidence down there, which they're going to be. Well, I mean, there's about, I would say, about maybe 120, 130 years worth of research work down there to be. It's that staggeringly large, and the resource remarkable. I went down there when I went down there with his team back in September, October last year. This is 2023. I hasten to add. I could see with my own eyes, bits of animal bone in the breccia, and that's what we're looking for. And luckily for us, the breccia is the stuff that they don't want, what they didn't want in the mining industry, or any other industry. So the breccia there is a resource. I suppose the only snag is trying to get the stuff in situ, because obviously these cave sites, including Rising Star, they've all had their brutal sort of occupation, for want of a better word, by us modern humans in the last 150, 200 years. And we've done our best to destroy the potential archaeology within those cave systems. But there's a hell of a lot of potential there.
Absolutely. And, I think a great way to finish off this first episode of the second season of the PaleoPost podcast would, and I can't believe I haven't actually asked you this before with all of our discussion on Naledi engravings, is for a rock art researcher such as yourself, someone who's been studying our modern capabilities of imagination and art and artistic ability, what would it mean to you if a small brained hominin was capable of course, we're not talking about creating masterpieces like Lost Skull or anything, but of what Lee's purported, what would that change, if anything, for you as a rock art researcher, that this hominin would be capable of doing that? What's at stake here?
The stakes are very, very high indeed, and I will say, I'll just say two words, or three words. We've got it. We've got what we want in many respects. All we need now is the scientific know-how, the scientific research to understand what it is. Is it art? Probably not. Are they markings as some form of communication? some sort of way of guiding people through, or guiding hominins through a particular system to a particular point, from one point to another. Then I think that's probably the answer. That's my interpretation of what's going on there. But we've got it. I'm convinced, and I dare say, if Genevieve was sat here with me now, she'd be nodding, saying, "Yes, we've got it," because we've seen it. With again, I recently this to Lee really to tell you this. But when I was down in the Rising Star, there were various parts of the cave system which we went to, and I would say that the thing I would say, it's a different type of mark. And again, I think I said to you this before, Seth. What we've got to do is for the critics of Lee and what he's been saying, is that we've got to take ourselves out of a 21st century mindset and think differently about what art or markings are to an early hominin. And I think we had to do that with Neanderthal. I think we've got to certainly do this with Naledi.
Absolutely. And I think that's a very strong place to leave this episode, for people to keep pondering and thinking and wondering, what does it really mean to make art? What is art? Did Naledi make engravings? And what does it mean if they did? Because, bears make engravings on cave wall. I mean, it's not making engravings on cave walls is not what's important here. It's what does it mean and why did they do it? That's what we're trying to figure out, and that's what your team is trying to figure out. And I think maybe we'll discuss more next week. I think what we'll do is maybe, after we talk about the news and your book reviews every week, maybe we'll give a little Naledi update and see what's kind of going on there.
Yeah,
but I think, yeah, what?
I suppose the one thing we can talk about next week, which will be good, will be about style and about the history of style. I think that's quite important because, the one thing we're not gifted with in many cave sites, including Rising Star, is the material for dating, and that's our big problem. So right. Again, we can talk about that next week if you like, and bring that up as a discussion point.
That sounds like a great thing to bring up. All right, guys, that is it for the first episode of the PaleoPost podcast, season 2. This is Dr. George Nash and Seth Choggy checking out. We hope you guys learned something, enjoyed, and if you did, please like, subscribe, rate, and share. It really helps us out and helps spread the word and help educate on human origins and the world around us and what's going on. This is Seth, and this is George.
Saying goodbye.
Sorry. Goodbye. We'll get it down. It's our first episode, guys. Give us a break. All right, everyone. We will see you next time.